Nearly 20 million voters with disabilities voted in the 2020 election, which was actually a bit of an increase over 2016. But heading into November, there's a lot of concern about how AI models might deter disabled voters from casting a ballot, especially when chatbots are spewing broken website links, false voter registration deadlines, and inaccurate information about important accessibility measures like curbside voting and mail in ballots. I'm Emily Elena Dugdale. I'm an AI reporter for Proof News. This is our Proof Ingredients video series, in which we talk with journalists, content creators, and experts about their investigations. At Proof News, we've been testing AI models for accuracy all year, and we're obviously thrilled that the tools and methodologies we've created are being used by people like Isabel Linzer. Today, we're going to talk to Isabel about what she found when she used our tool to ask some of the most popular AI models about voter access for people with disabilities. Isabel, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Emily. Thanks so much.
So tell us a little bit about your research. What were the ideas going into this? What did you want to look at? Let's just start there.
You gave a great introduction about how important AI is in this election, as well as the problems that voters with disabilities might face. And so from our perspective at CDT, we've seen lots of research out there on AI, on chatbots. Surveys have found that Americans are worried about the negative impacts of AI in this election. And lots of research, including the research by Proof, has found problems with what chatbots are providing, the information they're sharing when people ask election-related questions. So we identified a gap in the research. Specifically, we saw there wasn't a lot in out there about chatbots and voting with a disability, and that gap's a problem. Issues with information that chatbots provide may disproportionately affect voters with a disability for a few reasons. First, voting is simply more difficult for many voters with disabilities. There are barriers like coordinating help with transportation or assistance in completing and returning a ballot, as well as voter ID requirements, which disproportionately impact people with disabilities. Second, the way voting rules vary across the US, everyone knows that's already complicated. And then you add another layer on in terms of options for accessible voting, and you end up with an even more complicated legal regulatory system for voting with a disability. And then finally, like you said, chatbots, they're free, they're easy to use, and so they're generally kind of seen as an accessible tool. They're broadly compatible with assistive technology like screen readers, and so they could be a really important tool for learning voting-related information, especially for people with disabilities. So you end up with this complex voting and information environment, and on top of that, people with disabilities who might be more inclined to use the chatbots. And so we wanted to understand what those impacts are. If a group of people might be disproportionately affected when AI models are making mistakes, that's important for voters to know and for the AI developers to know.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really like that you pointed out how many Americans right now are already concerned about this topic. I think your report showed that the majority of Americans were like distrustful already of what is coming out of these chatbots. So to kind of follow up on what you just said, what did you think you would find when you first started digging into this? And kind of what was your hypothesis going into this?
Well, unfortunately, our hypothesis was that we would find that the information provided by chatbots could interfere with the ability of people with disabilities to access the information that they needed before voting and, in essence, impact their ability to exercise their right to vote. And that hypothesis, again, really came from CDT's participation in other work that Proof News has done in finding that misinformation or misleading information, omissions, these kinds of things show up in chatbot responses. And our hypothesis was that this problem would be more acute for when we ask questions specifically about voting with disability.
Yeah, let's get into a little bit about what exactly you did, to complete this research. So you asked
Mhm.
more than 70 questions about voting disabilities to each of the five leading AI models. What were some of these questions?
We ended up with over 300 responses. It's a lot to sort through. We asked questions about internet voting, about accessibility. So that's accessibility of polling places, curbside voting, absentee voting. We asked about laws on assistance for filling out and returning ballots. We asked about sources of authoritative information, things like, I'm a voter with a disability. Where should I look to get information about how to vote? Simple things like that, as well as some more complicated questions. We asked about guardianship. Guardianship, or sometimes called conservatorship, is when individuals with disabilities may have some of their decision making and civil rights removed from their responsibility if that is deemed to be something that they are not capable of. And in that case, some of those rights are put under the control of what's considered a guardian. There are some cases in some states, again, it varies widely, where a guardianship can be used as a way to limit someone's right to vote. We also asked about the policies that models have in place for queries about voting and disabilities. And that's really coming from what we've seen from companies themselves, where Gemini, for example, has restrictions on responses on voting related queries.
As I was reading through your report, some of the responses that stuck out to me was when you were talking about how the chatbots would misidentify states where you could even do mail-in ballots, which is just shocking. I live in California, so obviously mail-in ballots go to all of the voters here, but it's shocking that the chatbot would say that mail-in was an option where it wasn't, and vice versa. So I'm wondering if you could just take us through actually some of these standout responses, just a couple of highlights from the chatbots, and help us understand, why it is so important, that these chatbots are often just not getting things right.
So we ended up finding that 61% of responses had one kind of insufficiency, and over a third included incorrect information. And that incorrect information could range from a broken website link to things that are more severe, which are kind of what you're identifying in the examples you gave. And we actually found that a quarter of the responses from this standard query set could dissuade, impede, prevent the user from exercising their right to vote. And to kind of put you in the shoes of the user, imagine you wanted to check if curbside voting is allowed in your state. And the chatbot says yes. So then you go to the polls on election day, ready to curbside vote, and you find out that it's actually not an option allowed in your state. At that point, you might have missed the opportunity to vote. Maybe you would have needed to request an absentee ballot in advance, but it's election day and that opportunity is passed. So that's kind of a hypothetical, but it's a very real possibility based on the answers that we saw. We, for example, saw that ChatGPT said that curbside voting is allowed in all 50 states. That's simply not true. 27 states in DC have laws that allow or require curbside voting. We also, another example we saw, during these kind of questions about curbside voting, both ChatGPT and Claude said that ballot harvesting is illegal in Missouri. There are two problems with that response. First, ballot harvesting is a loaded, pejorative term, and using it to describe curbside voting could harm the user's trust in the election in the first place, as well as in the options that they have as accessible voting options. And second, curbside voting is legal in Missouri, and it's also legal for relatives to drop off someone's absentee ballot in Missouri. So again, you're getting these kinds of responses that could really impact how people view the election, how they approach the way that they can vote, and then ultimately could prevent them from casting their ballot. Another kind of version of this we saw that was less about the specific means of voting, but directing people towards different resources. We saw some pretty egregious hallucinations where chatbots recommended non-existent organizations as resources where people could seek assistance when they were trying to vote.
Isabel, I just want to, just for the audience that we have, can you define what a hallucination is? Because for me, I was like, whoa.
Yeah, of course. So hallucination, it's kind of it's a turn of phrase that's used in the kind of AI tech space, and is actually a difficult one when we're talking about voting with disabilities, because some people with disabilities do experience hallucinations, and the kind of using that terminology in the AI space could be problematic in some context. So I want to make really clear that this is kind of a term of art that's used in the kind of technology world context here, and isn't meant to kind of disparage that side of what people with disabilities may be experiencing. But the way it's used kind of in the tech space is it refers to inaccuracies, right? It's when a chatbot says something that's not true. We, in this report, tried to take that a step further to reflect the huge range of inaccuracies that we saw. So an example of a minor inaccuracy that would count as a hallucination, generally speaking, is when we ask a question and the chatbot responded by providing the phone number for the elections office in the town in Massachusetts that we were talking about. Well, I checked what that phone number was. It was actually the phone number for the electrical department. So that's an error. That's very different than when the chatbot creates information that has no basis in fact. It's completely novel, like making up an organization that does not exist and has never existed.
Well, I think I remember reading the report. The one of the chatbots created like a fake disability net, like they said the Utah Disability Action or something, or it was just. I mean, that might be not what it was, but it was like a completely
Yeah,
non-existent
no,
organization, right?
that's exactly right. The name exactly is escaping me, but it was a disability organization in Utah that the chatbot directed a user to. But that organization doesn't exist.
Right. So, we've chatted a little bit about some of the absurd responses that we've got that, you were able to get. And like you're pointing out, potentially dangerous because it could deter someone from voting, or they could sink a lot of time into looking at an organization that doesn't exist. But let's talk a little bit just briefly about, the process here. How did you come up with these questions? And maybe just briefly touch on the AI models that you actually used.
So the team came up, I wasn't the sole researcher on this, the team came up with this set of queries based on internal consultations as well as speaking with external disability rights experts and election experts. And we kind of focused on key voting issues that people with disabilities might run into. Those are things I mentioned, like absentee voting, accessibility of polling places, and then also kind of this chatbot preparedness question of, can they direct users to authoritative information? Do they know what their own policies are? And so the models that we queried using Proof's software were Mixtral, ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, and Llama. And so those are some of the big names. I personally have used them in my own private capacity. These are chatbots that people might be turning to as they're looking for authoritative information.
How did you check to determine the accuracy of the responses?
We did a very thorough fact checking of all of the responses, including things like checking phone numbers, emails, testing all of the URLs that the chatbots directed us to. All of the responses were scored on these kinds of binary yes, no questions we had to identify where there were insufficiencies, such as omitting key information that could be misleading, and also checking for when these kinds of insufficiencies we found could lead to harm. All of the responses and answers were reviewed by at least one election expert, as well as one expert at the intersection of disability rights and technology.
I think we touched on this kind of the big picture was over 60% of these models were, giving inaccurate information. But was any particular model standing out as kind of like particularly bad or actually, maybe good?
So it's a really interesting question. When we were looking at the kinds of insufficiencies we saw, we had omission, we had the structural issues, we had incorrect information. And one thing that stood out to us was that Gemini had a higher rate of lacking or evasion is what we called it, which is where the model simply didn't answer the question. It might have declined to answer the question. It might have directed the user elsewhere. But from a user's perspective, that's frustrating. You ask a question, you don't get an answer. So it was marked as an insufficiency. But what we saw in our research was that Gemini might have had a higher rate of insufficiencies for that reason, but also had a lower rate of inaccurate information compared with the other models. And that to us indicates there's this potential trade-off for the chatbots of providing information and making mistakes. So one conclusion that we can draw from that is sometimes actually declining to answer the question is probably the better, more responsible action for the chatbot at this stage when the rates of inaccuracies and omissions and other problems is so high.
That is fascinating, especially when the chatbots are supposed to give you information, but that they may be making a decision not to. That I'm going to be thinking about that. But in closing, Isabel, let's just talk really briefly about any limitations on this study. Did you feel like, there was anything more that you wish you could have done with more time and resources? And what could a follow up to this look like?
There's some kind of structural limitations with the software. So, for example, we're looking at the API. That's how the software is set up. And that means that we might not be seeing some of the canned responses, for example, that could come up when you're using the regular chatbot user interface. Or it might mean we're actually seeing less variability in the responses because the API is not relying on stored memory or chatbot history. It also meant we weren't always querying, these AI developers have many different models that are out there. So we weren't always querying the most up-to-date or newest chatbot. And then we also had some issues where sometimes the model wouldn't respond to the query. So those were some of kind of the structural limitations we encountered. Another is that we weren't really able to see under the hood. So when we asked similar questions with very slight wording changes, we often got different responses from the chatbot, like a single chatbot. And it's not clear to us from this vantage if the variation responses was due to our change in wording or because of the kind of variation that's baked into how the model functions, because the chatbot could just provide different answers even if you ask it the same question twice. So that's an area that would be quite interesting to look at further, especially where in examples where we found one version of a question revealed no problems and another version of the question the chatbot answered in a more problematic way. And then finally, like we were just talking about with Gemini and the kind of deciding whether to answer a question or not, a binary scale doesn't capture all of the nuance, but that's what the report's for. That's what the point of us talking is to kind of break down the detail. But I would be remiss if I didn't say we also saw some really good things. We saw some nuanced, responsible, dare I say, thoughtful answers when we asked questions about, for example, voting with a disability when COVID is out and about. So in other words, what we saw was a lot of problems, but we also saw the chatbots raise the bar on themselves. And I think that higher bar is the standard that we should be holding AI developers to, because we've seen the promise now, and that's what we should be working towards.
I love it. I'm here for ending on a positive note when we're talking about AI. So, Isabel, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation.
Thank you so much, Emily.
So you can read the full story on our website, proofnews.org. I'm your host, Emily Elena Dugdale. You can subscribe to the Proof News YouTube channel for more videos like this one. Thank you for watching and hope to see you soon.